Hello, welcome to this live Q&A session. I'm Reza Rad, very happy to be with you all here from RADACAD. And this is the live Q&A session we set up to answer some of your questions. We thought it's better to have like a public, like an office hour to answer the question. Now this might not take an hour, this might be more like a 30 minutes the first call. We'll see how this goes, and then based on that we'll do the other calls as well. This call is just me. I'll be answering your Power BI questions, but we'll have other calls later on other topics as well, like if there's AI, Charticulator, anything like that would be Layla and other calls around it. Now, how would you ask questions? Like you see that in the no, the other side. In the like beside me, there is a QR code. That is what you can scan. That takes you to the place that you can ask questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't like monitor all the questions coming from YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook to answer them all in one place. So what we've done is that we set up this Pigeonhole page. I mean, we didn't set the Pigeonhole. It's like a company that runs that. We just use it. You can access it using that QR code you see in there, or the URL, any of those. That is a place that you can go and ask your questions. And I'll be answering the questions based on that. So make sure that you go and ask your questions there, as many as questions you like. You can also vote for other people's questions. I would definitely encourage you to do that, because then I would select from those that have more votes, because that is what people are asking more. If there is any questions left today, we'll talk about it in the next session, whenever that might be. Okay, great. So let's jump into some of the questions. So as you see here, I have a list of questions already submitted. All of them have 0 vote. So I'll just start from those that are older. That comes from here. So starting from this, so please make sure that you go and ask your questions there. So the first question, would you suggest direct query or import data? This really depends on the size of data. Like one of the experiences I had earlier, about a year ago with a customer, was that they've been using direct query for their Power BI report. Now, direct query makes things slower because it's a direct connection to the data source, to SQL Server. Every time you see a visualization, it sends a query back to that source. The data comes back again. And if you have a page with 5-6 different visualization, that might be 5-6 different queries sent to the data source. The result comes back, which is good for big data sources, like scenarios that you have like trillions of data that you cannot fit inside a Power BI imported data set. You'll use direct query. But if you can actually import that data, then I wouldn't suggest direct query, because direct query will slow down the process of viewing the visualization. It will also bring some limitations on the measures you can use, on some of the Power Query transformations you can use. So I would suggest it this way, that try to import it. If you can import it, if your imported data set can be published to the Power BI service or wherever you are using it, Power BI report server, if you don't have any limitation on the size of your Power BI data set, then try to import it. If that doesn't work, then consider direct query, and always consider that there are like composite model options, that you can have some of the tables as direct query, but then aggregated versions of those as import data. Those are really good processes that can speed up the performance of your report. You can have like a big fact table with trillions of data, but then aggregated layers on top of that as aggregated tables, and those are all imported, so that users are always using these imported data. I have written like 5-6 different articles about how these aggregation works, so go and check it out. So short answer, try import data first, then if not possible, direct query. Long answer, what I already mentioned. Okay, back to the questions, and I see more questions coming. That's good. Okay, I said we'll pick from those that have more votes, so this one. from Power BI Lover, that's a good name, is Power BI alone is not enough for data analyst job role. Even after gaining proficient knowledge in Power BI, companies are asking for SQL or ETL to get into the job. Can you provide your thoughts? Okay, good question. Defining like a set of let's say tasks or activities for a data analyst is not easy, because it really depends on the company, on the team you are joining, on a lot of things, right? You may be joining a company which already have a BI team. They have a data warehouse. They have all the infrastructure in place. They want the data analyst to connect to that data warehouse, probably do some calculations such as measures, like few transformations, bringing that Excel data in as well, doing some visualization, things like that. In a scenario like that, usually the Power BI itself is enough. You don't need anything more than that. But there are also other types of things as well. You might join as a data analyst to a company that doesn't have any of these. The data is huge. The data comes from a lot of different places. Like data might be in Azure SQL database, Snowflake database. It's like trillions of data, rows of data. I'm not saying Power BI cannot handle it. Power BI can handle it, but in that size of data, certain transformations, if you want to do it, like grouping data, some of the aggregations, things like that, if you do it in Power Query, the performance might not be exactly as you do it in SQL statement, for example. You might create a view, T-SQL, use that as a source, then do some of the non-blocking transformations in Power Query to speed up the performance. So you may need some other components around it. Of course, in Power Query we have data flow, but data flow is still young. There are a lot of things happening in that area. So I would say this really depends on the job. If the job involves things more than just visualization and few calculations and things like that, then yes, I would say you'll need to know SQL language, not the SQL database itself. That might not be the big concern, because different companies use different relational database systems. Some of them might use SQL database on-prem, some of them Oracle, Azure SQL, Snowflake, any of those. That doesn't matter. You need to be able to write a SQL statement or understand a SQL statement. That is important. Knowing another ETL tool is good, although like Power Query and data flow can be helpful in a lot of situations, but it is good to know other ETL tools as well. Worst case, even if you don't know an ETL tool, as long as you can write a SQL statement, you can create stored procedure, define a job that runs those procedures, load data into tables. So you can kind of build that. But knowing things such as SSIS and other ETL tools, Azure Data Factory, might be helpful. Other things around Power BI can be also helpful as well, not just Power BI. For example, if you are developing a model in Power BI, things such as Tabular Editor, DAX Studio, these are helpful. So these are like third-party components for Power BI, but they can definitely help you in developing Power BI solutions. So I would say Power BI is good, perhaps not fully enough for doing, the skill and knowledge of Power BI, not fully enough for doing all sorts of things. You better to know things related to the type of job that you are performing as well. Okay, that took quite a lot of time to answer that. Okay, that's that question. I also mark these as answered so that I don't see that in my list again as well. Okay, so can't see any votes. So again, continuing from those that are coming from like oldest. Is there any extension for managing roles and role-level security in Power BI report server? We want to manage user access out of Power BI desktop or data warehouse. So when you want to manage user and access outside of Power BI, the answer is always dynamic row-level security. We have static row-level security where you go and define roles inside Power BI. You hard code those information inside Power BI. This means that every time you want to manage something, control it, you have to go and open Power BI desktop, change that, and then publish it again. But dynamic row-level security is saying that inside Power BI desktop is not much happening. The row-level security is defined based on the tables, the relationships, and you have a table with user email addresses in it. And everything happens in there. Now, that table can be in a data warehouse, in a database, that doesn't matter. Your report can be in Power BI service or Power BI report server, that also doesn't matter. But there is no tool, as far as I know, so that you can actually connect to that database and edit those values. However, that should not be hard to do. You can set up Power Apps or any application. You can write a custom application that connects to that database of tables with users, the roles, like different profiles. There are a lot of different scenarios and patterns you can do dynamic row-level security. Depends on the complexity of your model. So you can write a simple application that does that and use that application as your, let's say, extension for row-level security in Power BI. I have written a lot of articles about different patterns of row-level security, so go and check them out to learn more about it. Okay, good. What are scenarios when you would choose between star and Snowflake schema? And is it really a choice or a preference? I would suggest most of the time we'll go with the star schema. Why a star schema? Well, because it provides a cleaner data model for us, less relationships, more effective, let's say, querying across the data using the Vertipack engine or Power BI model engine, let's say, and simpler relationship concepts. So if you use a star schema, then most of your relationships are one-to-many from dimension tables into the fact tables instead of creating both directional relationship, because this table has to connect to this table has to connect to that table has to connect to that, and then you want the filtering across all of these. Something like that would require most of the cases both directional relationship. That is one of the reasons that Snowflake might not work. However, this is all case by case. Like you might define a star schema, but within your star schema, one specific table has one extra relationship in it, right? It all depends, but I would always suggest star schema. Defining your fact tables, your dimension tables, it takes time. You have to transform your data, but it is always better because it makes things much simpler in the model side. The more time you spend on data transformation to keep your model in the right format and load it into Power BI in that shape and format, the simpler your DAX measures would be, the simpler and more efficient your calculations would be, your relationships would be, everything would be much simpler rather than loading, let's say, 200 tables from a data source. They are all connected to each other, making everything both directional relationship, performance issues, writing a DAX measure that is like 200 lines because we haven't done a pivot or unpivot of a table or didn't combine some of these tables together to build like a dimension or a fact table. Right, so that is that one. Question from Bernard. Good to see you here, Bernard. What kind of functionalities do you think should be added or improved to Power BI in the following 2-3 years? Good question. So I would say things that I would like to see is making Power BI even more citizen data analyst friendly. Power BI is already for a citizen data analyst. I mean, everyone without having much knowledge can open Power BI desktop, connect to a data source, build a data model and visualize it. But if you go further, if you really want to build that data model, you see that, well, there are a lot of things around it. You need to write measures and measures needs DAX expressions. DAX is not simple. It is not easy to write. It's like takes time to get your head around it, understand how DAX calculation works. So I would say if you go a little bit further in your Power BI journey, you realize that you need to spend time learning some of the concepts such as DAX. I would say it would be good, or at least I would love to see Microsoft spending much more time on simplifying that process. I don't know how, I'm not the product owner, but I would say if that become simpler, we would see much better adoption of Power BI, definitely much better adoption of Power BI in the future, and many other things such as, for example, version control in Power BI that would be helpful. A lot of things that you actually, when you go to ideas.powerbi.com, you see that in the list, those that are big in the list. There are a lot of small things like this visualization, the title to be like customizable, things like that. Those would happen eventually. Those are not my big concern. I would say simplifying writing expressions, DAX expressions, that is one of the big things that can happen in Power BI. Version control definitely is a big win, like gradually coming into that. Better Power BI website modeling possibilities. At the moment we do this all in Power BI desktop, doing that all from website without needing Power BI desktop. That means that even Mac users can go and do everything in Power BI website without needing a Power BI desktop application. So things like that, major features like that, I think would be really helpful. Thank you, Bernard, for the question. Okay, another question. I have a measure summing values for different periods. There is a slicer filtering periods. Suppose for P5, I imagine that means period 5. I want to sum of the values IP4 and 5 by adding period to the table P4. Value is shown. How to omit 4. Okay, so very specific question, but I'll answer that to you like a bit general because I don't have that exact model with that exact expressions. Otherwise, I would share my screen and show it to you. I would say it this way, that so by default, Power BI visualizations are affecting each other. When you click on a slicer, this would filter, slice and dice the value you are showing in your measure. This is called filter context. Now, what you want in your measure is that you want to kind of not use exactly that filter context, change it a little bit, modify it in your expressions, which you can do that. You can first find out what measure is selected. There are like what value is selected in that slicer. There are different ways to do that. Like selected value is one of the things you can say, selected value of that P period, whatever it is. Find out, for example, period 5 is selected, then use some kind of like measures or some functions in DAX that gives you the previous version of this. This can be earlier, this can be sorting, getting the top one, a lot of other ways that you can get that. Then you get the P4 and P5, and then unfiltering that data using all, then filtering only P4, P5. It all depends on what sorts of functions you use in DAX. How do you do that? So there are plenty of different ways to do it. This is just, let's say, one way to do it. To actually doing it, we need to have that model and write that expression, but this is more like a generic answer to that. Okay, so we have a lot of questions with one votes. I'll start with those again asked a little bit older. Is it possible to use TreatAs within a measure to allow the physical date table to filter date column that is created using date betweens within a table variant that only exists within a measure? From Patrick. Thank you for the question. Now, this is also specific to like that model you are building. I don't have access to that model, but I can give you a little bit like generic advice on that. So usually we use TreatAs. We use TreatAs in many situations. One of the situations we use TreatAs is to kind of create virtual link virtual relationship between two tables, which we can create that virtual relationship with other functions as well, right? TreatAs is not the only function that gives you that option. One of the things about learning DAX is that in DAX you can use many functions to do things you want. Like if you can do something with TreatAs, definitely you can do that with something else as well. So TreatAs gives you that ability. Now you want to use TreatAs with a virtual table, a table that you created inside a measure. I'm not exactly sure would that TreatAs support that kind of virtual table. I would need to check it, but even if it doesn't support it, if it does support it, then your answer is yes, this will be able to filter that based on that virtual table. If it doesn't, then you can use other functions. You can use filter, you can use many other functions to do that. It's not just like TreatAs that gives you that functionality. So try to find a function that gives you the ability to use a virtual table as a parameter and then filter other data with that. Okay. Question from Mihai. How can I improve the performance of the model that has dozens of chained measure? Okay, and if I drag a few virtual in the table, the whole chain will be computed repeatedly for every single measure used. So yeah, measure is like this. Measures are not pre-calculated. Like if I have a measure X, which is calculating something, within that it uses measure Y, and that measure Y within that using measure Z. This means that whenever I see a visualization with measure X, measure Y and measure Z are also calculated. So these are all calculations happening at the same time. That is the nature of a measure in DAX and Power BI. They are calculated on the fly. If you want this calculation to be pre-calculated, then I would suggest you to do it as a pre-calculation. Perhaps some aggregated tables can help a lot. Based on that aggregated tables, you can create like a column, calculated column to that. This doesn't have to be in Power BI desktop as a DAX calculated column. This can be even in Power Query, or it can be back in the data source. When you create, let's say, a SQL view, you can add a column that does some of the calculations, and then when you load it into Power BI, you can have measures on top of that. Try to push some of your calculations to be pre-calculated as much as possible, especially when you have performance challenges. Considering aggregations is definitely a good idea, because your users are using the dimensions, the attributes that you are giving to them, right? Even if you have like tens of millions of rows of data, it happens really rare that users go and look at every single row in your data set. So you can consider aggregating that data. When you aggregate that data, a lot of your measures can be pre-calculated as well. Aggregating of the data means that you'll add more tables, so it takes a little bit of space, but aggregated tables are smaller. On the other hand side, they will give you a lot of performance. So I would say look at how you can increase the performance using aggregated tables, using pre-calculations, not specifically measures. This can be calculated columns or anything else. And at the end, the way that you wrote that DAX statement is also important. Like which functions you use, how you can improve that DAX expression, which things, tools like DAX Studio can help you to improve the performance of that specific measure. Okay, next question from Javier. Limitations on composite model, best practices on combining several data sets. Composite model is fairly new. I mean, not much new, but newer than import data itself, newer than direct query itself. So it is still growing with a lot of things around it. Limitations on composite model would be like there are some of the DAX functions that might not work when you have a composite model, that one table comes from, let's say, this source, another table comes from this source. You created a relationship, but still a few DAX functions wouldn't work. You still would be able to find some of the DAX functions that would work. There is a documentation in Power BI website that says which functions would not work, but those number of functions are changing, so you'll see more functions available a little bit later, definitely. Best practices, I would say. So first thing is that composite model. I would say it's a good thing because it kind of connects the IT or the BI team or the data warehouse team, whatever you might call it, with the data analyst. Previously, if I was a data analyst, I wanted to build a visualization. I had two options. I would either connect to the model that the IT team built, would create a live connection for me. I wouldn't had any option to add a new table coming from the Excel file that I have in OneDrive or anything like that. I wouldn't be able to do any modeling. I would just do the visualization. Or I would say, okay, I'm not going to use that model. I would create my own model, which create like a redundant situation. Now, composite model is saying that I can still connect to the model that IT provided, the BI team provided, then I can bring other stuff in it. So composite model is good for data analysts, but you have to put things around it, like some structure, some governance around it, how these models are stored in workspaces, how these models are published and shared with the users, who is certifying these data sets, all things around it. Those are things that needs to be watched. Composite model gives the power to the end user to reuse the existing model, add some things new into that, but without governance, this would end up with a lot of silos. So I would say best practices in a composite model is not much in how the design of the model works, but more inside the governance around it, how you put this structure together so that you make sure that you don't end up with hundreds of silos, everyone creating a model that might not, let's say, be good enough. Depends on the best practices defined in how to build data model, star schema, and anything around that. Okay, we have a few more minutes, so let's go through questions. Okay, we have one question with 7 votes. I hope you don't vote for your questions yourself. Okay, I have a star schema model on Azure Analysis Services. I would like to know if it is possible to combine restrictions on different dimensions with row-level security, different states with different markets. Yes, of course. Row-level security is all about that. You can define on a dimension that like you have a role that this role has access to California, this role has access to Texas. That is a static row level security. Or if you go more advanced, you can define table, you can create tables within your model. We call it dynamic row level security. In those tables you have roles, you have profiles, you have users with their emails that you use all of that within Power BI. This can be done in Azure Analysis Services or it can be done in Power BI model. Doesn't matter because they both use the same structure. I have some RLS articles which I strongly suggest to go and check out. I have written, I think, about 10-12 articles and a book on that. Okay, another question. How to improve the performance, okay, clicking on that, from Marco. How to improve the performance of refresh or refresh 4 model, I think, that consists of 26 Excel workbook on SharePoint site. Is it better to have tables in Excel workbook than ranges? I would say that perhaps wouldn't make much of a difference if you have it in workbook or ranges. You have 26 files. The connection to SharePoint might be something to consider. Depends on your let's say setup. Sometimes the SharePoint connections, I felt that it is slow. So 26 different files on a SharePoint might make things slower to get and to go and grab that data from that. So you might consider other things, like for example, you might consider creating a data flow that populates that SharePoint into a data flow, then Power BI getting that data from that data flow. Still, your refresh time is the same, but your Power BI desktop refresh time would be faster. You don't have to wait, like let's say, for an hour because, for example, your 26 different files takes some time. So I would say more of a like, is that data source connection fast enough or not? And SharePoint connection sometimes is not. So try to like combine it with some other ways, like a ETL tool that populates it in somewhere else and then use that. Okay, and the last question, I'll just have a look at these questions, see which one would be more interesting for most of you. Yeah, I think we'll go with this. What recommendation would you say should be followed when using a data gateway over a SQL database? Well, with the gateway connection, we do have a set of configuration you need to consider, like for example, what server specification you need to have, the gateway to be on a server with this much memory, this much CPU, things like that. You can find that a specification in Microsoft Power BI documentation. That's one thing. Another thing is adding things such as like gateway clusters, just in case one of them fails, you have the other one so that it can support your queries. Another thing would be a gateway that you use for import data, data sets to be different than the gateway you use for live connections. The reason is that if you have the import data gateway already busy with a lot of refresh requests, and then you have also a data set that is connected live to a Power BI report, and that is waiting for this gateway channel to be open, that would be like a bottleneck. So things like that, considering how this gateway is supporting your data sets and the performance around it, would be important. So I would mark this also as answered. So thank you for asking all of these questions. We'll have another call hopefully next week. If not the week after, we'll go through some of other questions, and I'll also go through some of these questions that I didn't have time to answer today in our blog. Thank you again for being with us today. I'll go back to this view. Yep, thank you for being with me today. I hope you enjoyed this Q&A. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I would try to answer it in the next Q&A or throughout the blog articles or any other methods. And until then, enjoy your day. Bye.